Hey Fizz and friends, I'd just like to address all the new listeners and say a big welcome. And I'd also like to say a massive thank you to the wonderful Mortis Media for giving my channel a little boost. Now today's stories are about that creep we've all run into at one time or another, about what could have happened, and to always keep your wits about you. So sit back and relax, turn your creep radar on, and remember, keep being creepy. When I was in my early 20s, I lived in an apartment with my mum, brother, and my 2 sons who were toddlers at the time. The guy who lived next door was about 60, worked for the cable company, and he had always given off serious creepy vibes. Now we were upgrading our internet, and another guy who worked for the same cable company came to do the installation. If I thought my neighbour was creepy, he had nothing on this guy. I was in and out whilst he was there that day, but every time we were in the same room, he would stare at me with a weird look on his face for an extremely uncomfortable amount of time. The next day was Saturday, and it seemed that my creepy neighbour must have been having a little get-together, and to my dismay, the creep who had done our installation was at the party. It was clear that they had been drinking all day and getting louder and more obnoxious as the day wore on. A little after 8 p.m, both my mum and brother left, leaving me there with just my 2 young sons. At around 8:30, there was a knock on my door, and there stood the creepy installation guy, who was clearly drunk, and he said that he had forgotten to have my mum sign a document the previous day. I said, "No problem, I'll sign it now," and he took a step forward in an attempt to enter our apartment. I positioned myself so that he couldn't get in the door, and again I said, "I'll just sign whatever you need." He then pointed towards the kitchen and said that he had given my mum the document and it was in our house. He pushed the door more aggressively and tried again to step inside the apartment, but this time I made a more forceful block of his attempt. At that point he turned his head to his left and said something to someone. I moved a little, just enough to see who he was talking to, and it was my creepy neighbour who was standing with his back pressed up against the wall of my apartment so that he was out of my line of sight. I quickly stepped back, shut and locked my door, watching them walk away. I knew then that the situation was super shady, but just how shady it was didn't occur to me until I was telling my family what had happened. Why would the guy have needed a signature on a document that he'd left with my mum? Why would he come at 8:30 at night when he had been drinking all day? Why did they wait until moments after my mum and brother had left? And why was my neighbour standing so that I couldn't see him? I'm glad that my creep radar was on full alert that night, because it really scares me to think what might have happened if I had let him walk into my apartment. All of this happened when I was a 5 or 6-year-old kid. I was living in a small 2-bedroom apartment with my mum, dad and my younger brother. Our apartment was located on the first floor of a 4-story apartment building, and I was sleeping in a small bedroom with my brother, who was 3 or 4. Now my parents' room was right next to ours, and the living room was across the hall, which had a small balcony which faced the courtyard of the building. It wasn't the best part of town, but a very safe city where crime rarely ever took place. Still, my parents were cautious and always closed and locked all of the doors. Though there was one night in particular that I still remember very vividly. I'd woken up because I could hear someone walking around. I could see a dark figure standing in the middle of the room, and at first I thought it was my mum taking my brother back to his bed, as he still often went into their room when he had nightmares. But then I realised my brother was sleeping safe and sound, as I could hear him breathing slowly and calmly. Also, the figure was bigger and wider than my mum, but since it was so dark I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. In fact, I wasn't even sure it was a real person at all or just a shadow. In the past, I had often had trouble sleeping at night because I believed the shadows in my room were monsters staring at me. My mother always told me that if I closed my eyes, they couldn't hurt me, so I closed my eyes and tried to go back to sleep. After a little time, I want to say a few minutes, but it might have been just seconds, my brother woke up and started crying. He got up and ran into my parents' bedroom, but I kept still, lying in my bed and keeping my eyes closed so the shadows would go away. The next thing I remember was waking up in the morning as if nothing had ever happened. Now I know you could easily brush this off as a kid having a nightmare, but hear me out. Here's where things get creepy. At breakfast, my brother couldn't stop talking about the man he saw. The men who were watching us, he said. My father told him to stop talking such nonsense, until I said that I'd seen a man too. Now my father got a bit angry, saying that if we kept talking about scary stories like this, we'd have trouble falling asleep at night. But my mum started freaking out. She said that in the middle of the night, she too woke up to a strange noise, and when she looked up, she saw a man standing in the doorway. When she reached over to get her glasses and take a better look though, the man was gone. She also thought it was just a shadow, but a few moments later, my brother came running into her room. We immediately looked at all the doors and windows. The front door was locked. However, we did discover that the balcony door wasn't. My parents checked all our belongings, every valuable item we had, but nothing was missing. Everything was exactly the way it was the evening before. We reported the incident to the police, but they weren't able to find any signs of a break-in. No fingerprints, nothing. My parents must have forgotten to lock the balcony door the night before, but needless to say, none of us slept well the next couple of nights. Thankfully, however, this was the only time these men ever came to our house. The fact that nothing had been taken always made it feel even creepier to me, though. With burglars, at least you know they're after your stuff, and not you. This story happened in a large suburb in California about 8 years ago. It was springtime, and I was enjoying the perfectly cool morning temperature during my morning routine. I grabbed my coffee and headed to my car to go to work, and noticed as usual that there were no other people in the parking lot, just lots of cars. I got in and started it up, and as it's warming up, I decided to plug in my audio cord and find some music for my short drive. In the midst of my blissful ignorance, though, I felt eyes on me, and looking up and over to my non-tinted passenger window, I became immediately shocked. Standing there was a boy about 10, with sunken eyes, his chin tilted downward, pale-faced, dripping wet hair, wearing a light sweater with holes, and who was just staring at me blankly. His face is now permanently ingrained in my memory. I'm startled easily, so between that and the blank expression, I was horrified and let out a scream. I looked around my car to make sure no one else was lurking around, and he just kept staring at me. I rolled down my passenger window slightly and asked, "Can I help you?" He mumbled something back to me with drool coming out of his mouth. My heart began pounding. His disheveled appearance combined with his incoherent state, I thought maybe he was a victim that had escaped from somewhere. I turned off my car and got out, rushed over to him, always watching to make sure no one else was around. I was scared that this boy might have been used to lure me in. I rushed to him and started asking questions, only getting mumbled responses, combined with drool. His eyes appeared to look like saucers to me. I thought for sure he was drugged, so I took him into my apartment and called 911. I told the operator that this kid seemed to be acting like maybe he'd been drugged or something, but I can't get any information out of him. He just mumbles and is drooling. I legitimately thought he'd escaped from a psycho's house where he was being held captive or something. The cops and paramedics arrived and whisked him away, and I head to work, although I'm very late at this point. That evening I got a call from one of the detectives explaining to me that this boy lives at a foster home up the street, and when he was in to take his morning shower, he jumped out of the window and ran away. He does this all the time, apparently, and the detective assured me that this boy puts on this act where he is incoherent to strangers for attention. He definitely wasn't drugged, but understood why I was so alarmed. For some reason, this doesn't add up to me, but what was I to do? They couldn't give me any information of where he lived, and I offered to help out at the foster family's home, but they said I would need to be licensed in some way, and that wouldn't assure my assignment to his home. The boy ran away from his foster home again a few weeks later and showed up at my door, so I let him in and tried to have a conversation with him. I fed him dinner and told him if he ever runs away to come to my house, and the police came again and took him home. It happened a few times after that, but then I never saw him again. I wonder what happened to that boy who gave me the creeps. Poor kid. So my mother, who was in her early 20s at the time, was travelling from City A to City B by bus for a business conference. Next to her was this young man, heading to the same city, and for the entire trip he was telling her how beautiful she was, how he had fallen in love with her, and it really scared my mother. She attempted to ignore his confessions, but they had to travel together non-stop for 5 hours in a full bus, then come to find out that they were to be staying at the same hotel. So that night, once they'd gotten to the hotel, this guy had somehow found her room and kept banging on her door, pleading her to open it and telling her he was crazy about her and he couldn't live without her. She was up all night and scared to death in her room. She had apparently notified the hotel, but they didn't do anything about it. By the morning, things had quietened down, and she was getting ready to leave the room. But as she went to open the door, she realized that it wouldn't open. It had been tied with wires from the outside, so she was stuck in the room. She banged on the door for a long time until the hotel employees heard her and were able to cut the wires and set her free. She bolted out of the room as fast as she could and bought the earliest ticket home. She called the cops and told them to get to the hotel and get the guy's info. And she never saw him again, thankfully. So I guess I found out why people don't pick up hitchhikers now. As I was driving from Texas to Cali, around an hour after I'd started my drive, I saw this guy with his dog on Route 66 in the middle of nowhere, and at least 3 miles away from even the nearest gas station. It was cold, and I wasn't in a rush, so I decided to ask him if he wanted a ride. Turned out he was trying to go to a city in Arizona that was only 20 miles off my route, so I offered to let them join me on the trip. He seemed normal and chilled, and looked like he cared for his dog. His original story was that he'd started walking in Mississippi after for some reason he'd lost his job and everything went down the drain. So he decided to walk and hitch to Texas, where he got stuck for 3 months and was trying to get to his mom so she could help him out. I bought him some food after asking if he'd eaten, which he said he hadn't. So the good deed endorphins were hitting me just right, and I felt like I was doing a good thing. When around 200 miles into the journey, he told me that he'd just called his mum while I was refilling my gas, and apparently she'd gone to LA for vacation, so he would just ride with me until I got to Cali. Okay, kind of weird and sporadic, but I didn't pay it too much mind. We chatted, and again everything was uneventful. That is, until we got to Arizona. He started bringing up Trump and how the election was stolen by pedophiles during his timeline. Okay, red flag. But I just asked him to drop it, as I don't like to talk about politics. He then asked if I could just drop him off with his, quote, 2 girlfriends at his house, which he got after his mum passed away, and he inherited in a town called Arizona. He said he'd called beforehand, and they were expecting him, after 3 months away. Also, he mentioned, like it was nothing, during an earlier conversation, that he has mild schizophrenia. I started putting it all together and realized that I don't think he even has a coherent goal of what he's doing. So when we got to Arizona finally, and we're on the last 10 miles to his now one girlfriend, which he claims he loves, I started to wonder, am I about to drop a mentally ill man off 2 states away in the middle of nowhere where it's about to get freezing temperatures tonight? Oh, and the plot thickens. He apparently didn't even have a phone. As we got to his girlfriend's house, I told him, "Hey, do you want me to wait here just in case she isn't home?" Thinking I could at least talk him into letting me drop him off at a nearby homeless shelter. And exactly what I expected to happen, happened. I guess I got the wrong info and she doesn't live there. My other family members live there though. So yeah, let's just go to Cali to see my mum. As he sat down in the car, which I have driven with him in for over 9 hours, I told him that maybe he isn't in the best mental state at the moment and his illness could be playing tricks with him. He completely flipped out at this suggestion and said if I bring up his schizophrenia again, he would kill me. He wasn't threatening at all, so I simply said, "Bro, I don't feel comfortable driving you to Cali, but don't want to leave you and your dog in the about to be freezing cold. Do you at least want me to drop you off at a homeless shelter?" "No, I'll just walk to Cali myself," he said, "in the mountain town of Arizona where it's about to be freezing cold, and he has no money, food or water, with at least 10 miles down a pretty uninhabited road." I'm pretty sure he didn't have family that lived in the house that he went to. He just left with his dog, and I sat there dumbfounded, and then left as there was nothing more I could have done at that point. I don't know where you are, dude, but I hope you're safe and get the help you need for you and your dog. I was accompanying my alma mater during a competition one day a few months after I'd graduated. We'd gotten front row seats to their choral speaking performance, and everything was great because I was surrounded by people. Right? Wrong. During the show I needed the bathroom, and as I made my way there, someone stopped me. He was sitting in one of the back rows that I had passed. I looked at him, eyebrows raised in surprise, but he just looked at me, grinning like a mad person. His friend stopped him, and I thought that maybe he thought I was someone else. But on my way back to my seat, he stopped me again, telling me to say hi to my teachers. It was a school competition, so it was obvious teachers were going to be there. Fast forward to lunch break, and I was going to my teacher to talk to them about something, and there he was, holding 2 drinks and just grinning at me, asking me if I wanted a drink. He stepped closer to me, and I stepped back immediately. It didn't feel right at all. It got to the point of being so uncomfortable that I had to get out of there, and I ate somewhere else. But then a few times I would glance his way, and he was still looking straight at me, grinning and doing the phone sign with his hands. It was like that whole day, and whenever I looked anywhere, he was there, watching and grinning. That day I was having to use the bathroom often for personal reasons, and I had to ask one of the students to accompany me because he would follow me wherever I went. Luckily he didn't come into the women's toilet, but still. The last I saw of him was when he was waving goodbye to our bus after I'd gotten on it, still smiling, still grinning, and still making that phone sign. I'm glad to say, though, I never saw him again after that. So I'm a bartender at a gentleman's club, and our uniform, if you can call it that, is a very short skimpy black dress and black bra. Due to my uniform being the way it is, I do my best not to have to go out in public directly after work, due to dirty looks or perverted comments that I just don't have time for. Back before the current state of the world, I had just gotten off work. It was around 2:30 a.m, and I decided to run to my local Walmart to grab some dog food and other household items I'd needed, thinking that there really wouldn't be anyone there besides staff. I ran in with a jacket to try and be a little modest and went directly to the pet aisle. There was a guy stocking the shelves. I gave a wave and smiled and proceeded to look for my dog's brand of food. I grabbed a 20-pound bag and the stocker asked if I needed help. I'm not really a small girl, but I have a slight frame. Like I'm tall but have a small waist. I told him I was fine but thanked him and headed to the grocery section. I was in the freezer section when my stalker showed up again, this time with another guy. They were just standing there watching me decide which pizza to pick, and when I turned to leave, Stalker asked me again if I needed help. I told him no, but thanked him again and smiled. I then made my way to the checkout aisles, and on my way out, I saw a man heading out about 10 foot behind me. I quickly walked to my car, threw my purchases in the passenger side, and jumped in and locked my doors. I was worried he would try and talk to me, and I just wanted to go home. I felt dumb after realizing the guy went to his own car and wasn't even near me and started my 15-minute drive home. I was about halfway home when I noticed this black car behind me, taking all the same turns as me. I live in a rural area, and while it's possible he lived nearby, there aren't many people that take these roads. I turned a road after mine and he made the same turn. It leads to a dead-end road with a cow farm, so I knew he wasn't following me. I get to the end of the road and do a quick 3-point turn and speed back out onto the main road, but he's still behind me. I called my boyfriend and told him what was going on and that I didn't want to drive home where he would know where we lived, and asked him to meet me at Walmart. I sped the whole way there, hoping a cop wasn't sitting somewhere and would pull us over. Black car guy is still on my ass. I pulled into the Walmart parking lot and parked under a street lamp, and black car pulls into the spot across from mine. I'm freaking out at this point, and about 15 seconds later I see my boyfriend's truck, and he pulls up next to me, asks if I'm okay, and I point to the car. Now my boyfriend is not a small man. He's about 6'4" and huge, like his arms are the size of my head. He's very intimidating, but a very quiet and kind man. He got out of his truck and started to walk over to the car, and yells to them, "Do you need to talk to her or something?" The guy in the black car took off. Now I don't know if it was the man that was hanging out with the stalker, but I don't go out after work anymore. This happened about 2 years ago in Iowa. I'm a Dutch girl and I was visiting a friend over there. Whilst there it was obvious I was foreign, as I was way taller than most Americans, and I dressed differently. The most obvious part was that I didn't know my way around and was always using navigation to get to places. I was visiting my friend, but she still had to work during the day, so I had to entertain myself. It was about 11 a.m. on a weekday, and I was walking to the local Goodwill to go thrift shopping. Now, being it was this time of day, there weren't many people in the streets, and I was kind of struggling to find the building, and my eyes were glued to Google Maps, when I noticed this dude parks his car right next to where I was standing. Now, I found this kind of strange since all the parking spots in the entire street were empty, but I didn't notice this straight away, as my eyes were glued to Google Maps. He then got out of his car, greeted me and asked me how I was doing. Initially I thought this was kind of strange, because where I'm from, strangers don't randomly talk to you. But then I remembered I was in the USA, and this was probably fine, so I responded in saying I was doing fine. He then asked me if I was a local, and once again initially I thought it was weird, but shrugged it off due to cultural differences. I said I wasn't local, and he then proceeded to tell me that I looked exotic. This made me feel uncomfortable. He started to ask me all kinds of questions about what I was doing in Iowa, and I answered them in a very brief way, as I was getting more and more uncomfortable by the minute, due to the nature of the questions. It was like he was trying to figure something out about me. When he then asked me if I was alone, my alarm bells went off. I made up an excuse and told him my friend was waiting for me inside of Goodwill, and that I should go and see her now. I didn't even wait for a response, and I just walked inside. I felt super creeped out, so I kind of stayed hovering near the cash register for a few minutes. His car was still parked outside, and after about 5 minutes he came in. Luckily, I was out of his sight, and took the opportunity to book it. I still wonder to this day what he wanted from me. To start off, let me say that I had a rather sheltered childhood. My dad was in the military, so my family lived on an army base, which is sort of like an ultra-gated community. Anyone coming in through the gates had to show ID, and it was pretty much isolated from the rest of the city that surrounded it. Because of this, I had a lot of freedom to explore and spend time outside, unsupervised. That's why I find it especially strange that I had this encounter on a summer's day in my pre-adolescence about 12 years ago. On the base that I lived in, there was a public pool where we would go most days during the summer. It was pretty big, and its main attraction were the 3 different slides that it had. I had just passed the swim test that was required in order to ride the largest slide, so I was extra eager to go to the pool that day. Our family friends lived down the street, and they had several children. 2 of the girls were close to my age, and they had an older brother who was going to drive us all to the pool for that day. They literally lived about 9 houses down the road, so I donned my one-piece bathing suit and flip-flops, wrapped a towel around my waist, and grabbed my pool bag under my arm so I could head over and start the day. One important detail is that I wore glasses at the time. I got them when I was around 9, and my vision wasn't too terrible back then, though it's gotten a lot worse in the years since. I was too young to have contacts at the time, so I would just leave my glasses at home so that I wouldn't lose them at the pool. I began my walk to my friend's house. As I walked along the sidewalk, the row of houses was on my right, the street was to my left, and there was a parade field on the other side of the road. Since this was a main road, nobody was allowed to park on the street in front of the houses, and everyone would instead park on the service road behind them. This is why I noticed that a car passed me and parked right in front of my friend's house. I figured my friend's brother must have invited someone to the pool with us. I noticed someone get out of the car, and to my surprise they didn't walk to my friend's house. They walked up the sidewalk towards me. As the person drew closer, I saw that it was a guy. That's really all I could see. He seemed to be an average height, somewhat skinny dude. Again, I kept thinking that it was my neighbour's friend, and he was going to ask me if he had the right house or something. He finally approached me, and all I remember being able to see about him was that he seemed relatively young and had brown hair. Honestly, at this point, I really wasn't thinking too much of it. "Hey," he said, "are you going to the pool?" I remember thinking, duh, since I was wearing my swimsuit and a towel, but I replied with a yes. "Oh, cool. Is it that big one with the curly slide?" he asked. I replied that it was. There was another pool on the base that was smaller and had no slides, so I figured he was just trying to determine which one I was going to. "Really? I'm going there too," he said. "I can give you a ride if you want." His tone was friendly enough, but I instantly felt adrenaline surge through my body. I may have been a sheltered child, but this was the exact scenario that I had seen in countless movies and PSAs, and I instantly felt panicked. Some stranger asking me to get in their car with them was not something that I was dumb enough to accept, not after years of stranger danger conditioning. No thanks," I answered him. I remember straining to look at him, to see some defining characteristic that I could tell my mum about later. but I wasn't about to get closer to him to get a better look, and all I could make out was brown hair, and that he seemed young. "Okay, well, would you be able to give me directions there then? If you come to my car, I have a map, and you can show me the way," he said nonchalantly. My panic instantly rose when he mentioned coming to his car, and it struck me as super strange that he apparently knew the pool I was talking about, offered to drive me there, but then suddenly claimed he didn't know where it was. All I could think about was getting away from him, so I just stammered, "No, I'm good, and I'm riding with my friends, so I'll just go with them." He just said okay and walked back to his car. I had to walk the same direction as him, but I cut diagonally through all my neighbours' yards so I wouldn't have to risk walking near his car. He reached his car and got inside, but he didn't drive away. I remember wishing so badly that I could see the license plate, but that was way too far for my eyes to make out. As I walked to my friend's door, I knocked frantically and kept looking behind me to see that the car was still there. They answered in about 30 seconds, and as soon as they opened the door, he drove off. My friend's mum was the one who answered, and she could tell something was wrong. I told her what had happened, and I think that they ended up calling the local cops, but nothing ever came of it. To this day, the entire encounter really confuses me. The guy really didn't seem threatening, and when I told people that he seemed to be young, in his early 20s maybe, everyone kind of brushed it off. But I just can't imagine anyone having good reasons for inviting an unknown 11-year-old girl into their car. Either your intentions are bad, or you're so incredibly stupid that you don't realize how creepy you are. I guess I'll never know what was up with that guy that day. Hey everyone, I'm fairly new to Reddit, but I've grown addicted to reading these and similar stories. It's becoming clear that there are definite similarities to many of these encounters. Lots of stories as grocery stores, Walmarts, Targets as the location. It's clear these are becoming prime spots for kidnappings and abductions, and I hope by sharing this everyone becomes a little more aware and cautious. This is my story. It was a couple of years ago when I was in my late 20s, and I needed to grab a few things from the store on my way home. I parked up, got out, and started walking towards the entrance. This store was set up with two entrances on opposite sides of the store, and both facing the parking lot. So I'm walking towards the far left entrance, and it's the middle of the day, so there's lots of people about. Now at the time my kids were just 1 and 3. I have always been super aware of my surroundings, always keeping my head on a swivel, and any time that I did take my kids with me, which was rare unless absolutely necessary, I was on hyper mode. I've been called a bitch before because I've cut conversations short with strangers. I'm not sure if having kids finally matured me enough or what, but as a female especially, I had finally reached a point in my life where I didn't feel the need to indulge strangers and make small talk, and be polite in situations that made me uncomfortable. Now I didn't have my kids at this time, so while I was still alert, I wasn't all out mama bear mode. As I crossed the main street into the parking lot that goes right in front of the store, entering the covered but still outdoor portion of the store that has the red box machine and carts, a man in a black hoodie started walking towards me from the right, and immediately caught my eye. He's wearing his hood up, and despite the fact that it was a hot day, the vibes just weren't right. I kept an eye on him as I continued walking, and as I'm nearing the actual doors inside, he was getting closer to me on my right. I braced myself for catcalls. Now I admit that I'm cute. I'm not all that, but I've been catcalled various times. However, I didn't hear anything. I entered the doors and turned my head slightly to the left, and I can see out of my peripheral vision that the guy continued to pass me. Okay, I let my guard down a bit now. This particular entrance takes you into the produce section, so I started grabbing what I needed with the entrance behind me. After finishing in this section, I walk back towards the entrance, make a left and head towards the other aisles. and sure enough, as I'm turning back towards the front, I see the guy, and he's looking at me. At this point, even though I have alarm bells sounding in my head, I still told myself that there's no way this dude is following me. As I made my left out of produce, I glanced back and noticed that he was now walking behind me. Again, I'm like, this can't possibly be happening. It's daytime and there are people everywhere. He can't be following me. But deep down, I think I knew he was. I sped up and made a turn down the baby aisle, thinking, okay, what are the chances that he needs baby stuff? If he follows me down this aisle, then it's obvious. So I walked to the middle of the other end of the aisle, turned and waited. He's coming round the corner. My stomach dropped. There's no one but me and him in this aisle. I get a good look at him. His hood is still up and he's got no groceries. He's got one hand in his hoodie pocket, and I notice something in his other hand. Now I don't know why, but I think it was a Bible, as it looked like a small black leather book or box. That for some reason made me much more nervous. He also appeared now to be either talking to himself or on maybe a Bluetooth piece under his hood. I'm going back and forth in my mind with thoughts of potential kidnapper or someone with a mental illness perhaps. Either way, neither sounded good to me. He turned into the aisle and we're now facing each other. As I back away the opposite end of the aisle, he slowly started walking towards me, mumbling. And this is really strange, because knowing all I know, all the precautions and scenarios I've run through, when something like this is actually happening to you, it's like nothing you could ever prepare for. He's still walking towards me, slowly, so I say very loudly, "What do you want?" And he quietly laughed. I booked it out of the aisle and weaved up and down random ones until I got to the checkout line. The girl at the checkout was younger than me, with a kind of a flippant attitude, but first thing I said was, "There's a man in here that's following me." Now this checkout girl was facing the other entrance, and I could see the man now at that entrance. I don't think he could see me, but he was just standing by there. I pointed at him and said again to the girl, "He followed me in here and has followed me around the store." My voice was shaking, so I think she could tell I was scared, but I don't think she knew what to do. She asked if I needed someone to walk to my car with me, and I don't know why I said no, but I said something like, "You just need to keep him there so I can leave out the other door." She said okay, and I jogged to the entrance that I'd come in and out and to my car. Once in, I could see the store associates escorting the guy out the other door. This was a pretty anticlimactic story, I know, but I'm glad that it was a boring ending. I'm not sure what become of that situation, but I do know there have been some recent news stories of an attempted kidnapping and other things at that same location. It seems like situations like this are happening more and more. Everyone but ladies especially, please listen to your guts. There is something to be said about a woman's intuition. Be aware of your surroundings and never feel like you have to be nice to people who make you uncomfortable. This story is quite short and fairly uneventful, but I still feel that it was weird, so I felt like sharing it. I went to an abandoned mill today with two of my friends, Haley and Kennedy. It overlooks a man-made dam across a large river and has many areas that cannot be seen from the main road. I've been here several times before, and although I've encountered other people, it's usually those my age who have just come to smoke and spray paint or even fish. Today we noticed that there was a truck parked by the dam. It was kind of weird, as most people just walk from the road, but I didn't really question it. But I did notice, however, that the windshield wipers were on, and figured that they must be about to leave. We proceeded to walk down a hill to a building that continues to some rocks that overlook the river. Within a few minutes, the man from the truck had walked down to the sand by the river and could obviously see us. He knows too that we can see him, and I then noticed that there was something in his hand, but I didn't question it. We were honestly just waiting for him to leave so we could smoke. Eventually he left the sandy area, and I asked Haley to check and see where he'd gone. It's difficult to explain the layout, but essentially I could see Haley from where I was standing by the rocks, and I saw her wave to someone. She came back and said that the guy has a hacksaw, is very close to where we are, and showed no expression towards her. Maybe it's just all of the true crime stories I've listened to, and my experience as a woman, but I suddenly felt very uncomfortable with this situation. If the guy were to walk closer to us, we would have no option but to move past him, as in front of us is the rocks leading straight to the dam and river, which must roughly be 150 feet drop at least. I didn't want to assume that he had bad intentions, but I mean, he has a hacksaw. Although I'm weirded out, I don't feel afraid for my safety at this point. We continued walking around the mill, and very quickly noticed that he seemed to be following us. He never stayed too close to us, but certainly close enough to keep an eye on us. This area is pretty big, and I know there's no way it's a coincidence. He's also by himself and isn't fishing or doing anything. He's just walking around and swinging his hacksaw like a circus clown. I was looking at us a lot too. It's also important to note that it's really cold and rainy, so the ground is quite muddy. I couldn't help but note that this would make it harder to run if something were to happen. We finally gave in to being really creeped out and decided to leave, but exit the mill in a different direction than we'd entered. Before we set off, I noticed he was in the direction of where we had originally entered. Now we have to walk up a muddy hill that's maybe a quarter of a mile to get to the main road, which is already in a pretty isolated area. And as we're trying to fathom this more than the strange situation, I glanced behind me and noticed that the hacksaw guy is way too close for comfort and is walking faster than he had done before. We picked up the pace as well and thankfully made it to my car, which is parked right at the exit. I still don't know what this guy was doing, but it rattled my friends and I quite a bit. I know he wasn't patrolling the area, as he would have just told us to leave if he was. My imagination, though, sure can come up with a few scenarios. This creepy encounter happened about 2 years ago. My boyfriend and I were both studying abroad in Poland, and we were just coming back from a short trip visiting home. For some reason, our usual train route was cancelled, so the conductor told us that we had to get off in a Polish city that I've never heard of before and change trains there. It was cold and started to get dark outside when we'd arrived. The train station was located out in the countryside, and it had only 2 tracks, one dead end and a staircase to an underground. Only my boyfriend and I left the train at that stop, and the train left shortly after. We looked at the schedule, but we couldn't see the name of our city, and we started to wonder if we'd gotten off at the wrong station. Now, I don't speak Polish very well, and my boyfriend only knew thank you, hello, and goodbye. My boyfriend suggested one of us go downstairs and look for someone that could help us, and we had 2 heavy suitcases, so one of us was going to stay behind with them. At that moment, I got an uneasy feeling, but I let him go as I didn't want to enter that creepy underground by myself. I sat down on a nearby bench as my boyfriend left, and the wind was really cold, so I decided to open my backpack and pull out my beanie. Suddenly I felt it had gotten really dark, and I also noticed a change of smell. I pulled out my beanie, and as I turned around, I saw a guy had sneaked up on me and was now standing right in front of me. He was very tall and was on the heavier side. My boyfriend is a tall guy, but this man was at least a head taller. I was shocked because he had just appeared out of nowhere, smelled like dirt, and he was just standing there, smiling, and now waving at me. I smiled back, not wanting to be rude, and he came closer. He started asking me something in Polish and pointed at the arrival departure screen. I could only make out the name of our city in his question, so I replied by saying the city name, and he said yes in Polish. I, for some reason, smiled and said in English, "I don't know what you're saying, but we are going to that city as well." He gave me a big smile and kept talking to me in Polish, both asking questions and just talking. I kept saying, "Sorry, English?" in both English and Polish, but he just kept on talking. Suddenly he stopped, as if he had remembered something, and he came a few steps closer, making a finger gesture, motioning me to come closer to him. I was still sitting on the bench, so I leaned in. Suddenly he screamed in my face, in good English, "My name is Andrew." I was startled and looked at him completely in shock. He then just smiled, started laughing in a maniacal way, and walked towards the dead end of the station. Not long after that, my boyfriend came back after not being able to find a single soul. I told him what had just happened, and I had just finished, when creepy guy Andrew returned out of nowhere again, but this time he was not smiling. He stopped in front of us and looked me dead in the eye, pointed at my boyfriend, and asked something in Polish again. I could only make out the word brother, so I figured he'd asked me if my boyfriend was my brother. Now I couldn't remember the word boyfriend in Polish for the life of me. All I could remember was żona, which means wife. So I pointed to my boyfriend and to myself and said, "Żona." He looked shocked and angry at the same time, like I had just betrayed him. It looked like he was about to scream again, but instead he burst into a maniacal laugh. He took out his phone and pointed at my phone, which was in my hand, and it was obvious he wanted my phone number. I was getting beyond anxious and looked at my boyfriend, saying in our language, "Please, what do we do? I don't like this. What if I give him a fake number and he calls it, and it's not my number?" Then creepy guy Andrew again started to speak English. He told me that he wanted me to call his sister, who spoke English. I said no to him, but then he became really persistent and gradually more aggressive. My boyfriend looked back at creepy guy Andrew, smiled politely and said 2 of the 3 things he could say in Polish: "Thank you and goodbye." Creepy guy Andrew got mad and left. Finally a train had arrived, but we didn't know if it was the right one. Regardless, we took our suitcases and hurried onto it, losing sight of creepy Andrew in the process. When we sat down on the train, I was so happy and relieved. But unfortunately, the happiness got abruptly stopped by the familiar, maniacal laugh coming from our carriage. Creepy Andrew had made it onto the train. He was sitting on the opposite side, laughing and talking to himself in Polish. I could make out the word żona and a common cuss word, so I knew he was talking about me in a bad way. During the train ride home, which was only about 20 minutes, he changed seats a few times, but he never came too close. He kept on talking though, and I felt uneasy for the entire journey. We were on edge, just waiting for him to do something. Thankfully though, he didn't, and we managed to get off the train in our city, then get in an Uber that was waiting for us. I thankfully never saw creepy Andrew again, but it was worrying to know that he was lurking around in my city. I seem to be a magnet for creeps and weirdos, and since I got such a positive response on my last experience, I figured I would share a few more with you all. So some background to start with. These all took place outside my home at the time, which was on the literal last block of a major city right across the street from the beach. The building was framed on 4 sides by the beach, the woods, a construction site, and a few other sleepy houses, as well as a Muni line. Think the subway, but above ground. It's the very last stop on the Muni, so unless you catch it the right time of day or at the height of tourist season, the area is basically empty on the sidewalks. The house itself has an initial patio door, which doesn't always fully close if you don't slam it, and then an entry area with a staircase and leading up to a second locked door that leads to the apartment. So the first experience I want to tell you about. I got home from work one day at about 9 p.m. and immediately got into a small spat with my roommates. After about 30 minutes, I decided to leave the house to cool off. I had planned on sitting on the porch outside, but as I looked across the street at the ocean, I decided it would be more peaceful there. I had never been to the beach at night, for safety reasons, but as I looked at the well-lit parking lot and no one in sight, I decided it would be all right. In the 1-block span from the beach to my home, there was a little wooded path that started on my street and dumped you out at the crosswalk for the beach. It also intersected with another pathway that took you down to the coast. I sat for a bit. Everything was fine, and after a while I started the 1-minute walk back onto the little path. All of a sudden I looked up and saw a man walking briskly on the intersection path and looking right at me. I sped up a bit and tried to ignore him as we hit the section where the two paths intersect. I ended up being about a foot away from him, and he called out to me, "Hey, I want to talk to you." I ignored him, and after a few more steps, he reached out his hand and grabbed part of my hair, saying, "Hey, come here." I immediately yanked my hair out of his hand and booked it to the last block, sprinting to my house, and I can hear him running behind me. I turned the corner sharply and am briefly out of his sight, and luckily the initial entryway to the patio had been left open by accident, so I run through the door and slam it shut. I could hear his footsteps stop outside, followed by silence. As I went upstairs and looked through our front window, I could see him walking away into the construction site. My second experience. I had a friend that lived a couple of blocks away from where I was, along the same stretch of beach. After hanging out one day, I decided to head back home around sunset. I've walked this route many times, and it's just barely light outside still, only a 5-minute walk, so I figured I'd be home before dark. As I crossed the intersection from their house, I noticed a white van parked on the corner that is not usually there, covering a little garden I like to look at on my way back. I can just barely make out 2 people in the front seat, and I think it's odd, but okay, whatever, and pulled out my pepper spray just in case. I crossed the street passing the van, and now have my back to it. As soon as my foot hit the pavement on the other side of the street, I heard the van start up. I turned my head just slightly and saw them illegally turning onto the street where I am now walking. They creeped the van beside me slowly, just behind me, but within my peripheral vision. I decided to stop and let them pass. I paused and pretended to be looking on my phone, and saw them stop driving immediately. And this was a nope from me, and I broke into a run, the van following me, to a small vintage motel about 1 building away that I know has an open entrance courtyard. And so as I approached it, I turned quickly into the yard and ran up to an archway entry for a unit. I stopped at the first few steps, catching my breath, and I opened my phone front camera to use as a sort of mirror to see what the van was doing. They had backed up to the entry of the motel and sat there for a few minutes. Then, the person on the passenger side opened the door and started walking towards the motel, his phone flashlight on, and I immediately pulled my phone back, listening for his footsteps and readying myself to start banging on the motel door, hoping someone was inside. I waited in silence for a long time, long enough for it to get dark, when I finally looked out again, and both the man and the van were gone. I called an Uber to take me the last 2 blocks, sorry Uber driver, and never saw them again. Experience number 3. I had a friend over and we wanted to dab, which is a form of smoking weed. It was about 10 p.m. and my roommates didn't like dabbing in the house because of the smell, so he and I went to his car that was parked out front. We're in there having a good time when I noticed a person walking down the block, pulling on car door handles. I notified him and we watched as the same person comes up to his car and yanks on his back door. He honked his horn and they back up for a minute, then walked up to his driver window and knock on it, making a motion to roll it down. Just as I'm about to tell him don't, he rolls down the window a bit. The person is clean and normally clothed, and asks what day it is, and then what time it is, to which my friend answers. They then stand there and stare at us as he tries to usher them away, even offering them money. Without saying anything, they walked away down the block, and once they'd reached the intersection between the construction site and the woods, they rolled their head back up to the sky and just started screaming at the top of their lungs as they back away out of sight. I took this opportunity to dart back inside my house as my friend watches, making sure to close the patio door. A few hours later, one of my roommates comes home very drunk, and as we figured later, they'd failed to make sure the patio door was shut all the way. The next morning, and I woke up in an empty apartment. I opened my phone and had a singular message from my roommate from 3 hours ago, stating that when they'd left for work this morning, there was a person they didn't know sleeping inside the patio area. They thought it was a drunk person who lived in the neighborhood and entered the wrong house by mistake. But they evidently didn't find it enough of a reason to call me or wake me up. I immediately went to the entry of our apartment, pulling the door open fast. And to my surprise, the person who had been talking to us in the car the night before was laying casually across my staircase, fiddling with something. I scream "Hey" loudly, and they immediately hop up and run out of my patio door. I run down the stairs after them and open the door. They're standing across the street, just smiling at me and giggling. They then give me a little wave and run off. I closed the door hard and went back upstairs to what items they had left. Sitting on the steps was a few coins, some weird wire-type objects. Think a bobby pin after you've bent it into a straight line, a lighter and a pocket knife. Thankfully, we never saw them again. I'm a female, and this took place when I was about 17. I'd moved in to my brother and sister-in-law's apartment in the city. I was a very innocent 17-year-old, and I still had a lot to learn about the world and what people are capable of. I was working the evening shift at my job, so they let me stay in their spare room whilst I saved up to get my own place. Now they used the living room as their bedroom because the other rooms were too small, so when I'd got home from work, I had to either park around the back of the building and go in the back door, or park on the street out front and walk through an alleyway which also led to the back door. One night I got home from work and decided I wasn't ready for sleep yet. It was about 2 a.m. and I was still amped from work, so I poured myself a drink and walked around to the front of the building to sit on the front steps and enjoy the night air before bed. Whilst I was sipping my drink and listening to some music on my headphones, someone came out of the building next door and sat down on their steps. It was a young man around my age, and after a few moments, he started to talk to me. I realized he was pretty drunk, but seemed harmless, so we chatted for a few minutes. He started telling me a story about how he'd chased some guy with a machete. Just normal late-night chatter, and cue all the red flags. Then, his friend also came out and sat on the steps. His friend was fully wasted. Gonzo. He was just sitting there holding his head in his hands. I decided it was time to go in, so I said, "Well, I better get going. Have a good night." And I stood up to walk through the alleyway between the two buildings. I was nervous about going through there, but it was either that or walk all the way down the street and around the block to get to the back of the building. I went on my way, trying to stay calm and not appear freaked out, when I looked behind me and realized drunk guy is following me through the alleyway. He says, "Where are you going?" "I've got to get home," I said. "You gonna leave without giving me a kiss goodnight?" "I don't know you," I said, a bit taken aback. "Come on, just one kiss." At this point, I'm starting to get nervous about where this is going, when he snags his jacket on a nail in the alleyway. I use this moment to make my way out of there, and to my door, but he unsnags himself and catches up to me, asking if he can come in. Now, I've never met this guy in my life, so I tell him, "Sorry, my brother and sister-in-law are sleeping." And I slowly close the door while he stands there staring drunkenly at me, half expecting this to go sideways. The way I figure, that night could have gone two ways. I was super relieved it ended with him on the other side of that door and me safely in my own house. I never saw him again, and I never went out at night by myself to sit on the front steps again. I learned a valuable lesson that night. Potentially dangerous situations can creep up on you. You don't always see them coming until they're following you through a dark alley. Try not to put yourself in those situations and anticipate the creepy.